In a time of crisis, the Australian people have rallied and been united in their response. They are looking to us now, in this place, for unity and leadership to be safe in the future. It's been predicted that without action now, impacts and events resulting from global warming will get much worse. Will you honour the sacrifice of all those impacted during this bushfire crisis by showing bipartisan support for effective, long-term plans to lower our emissions, mitigate the worst of climate change and, united, keep Australians safe?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for her question. In the Royal Commission that we are seeking to establish, and I have written to the state and territory premiers and chief ministers to get their comment and feedback on that Royal Commission terms of reference. There, Mr Speaker, it is accepted that climate change has impacted Australia and that we're in for longer, hotter, drier summers, and that there are actions that we need to take to protect Australians into the future. Those actions are many, and in my address to the National Press Club last week I set out what they were. Of course, Australia must continue to take the actions we are to meet and beat our emissions reductions target, which have already seen us reduce emissions, Mr Speaker, by 12.8% since 2005. We have emissions reduction target that we took to the Australian people out to 2030 that will see emissions per capita fall by half. Mr Speaker, we are ahead of countries like New Zealand, we're ahead of countries like Canada in meeting and beating our targets. Mr Speaker, some 411 million tonnes we will have beat our Kyoto emissions target, and at the same time our renewable energy, Mr Speaker, per capita is half what's being is double, I should say, more than double what's being achieved in Germany and in many other countries around the world, and we have one of the highest levels of investments in renewable energy anywhere in the world, Mr Speaker, in the developed world, and we have one of the highest, in fact we have the highest target of emissions reduction out to 2030 in Asia compared to those nations. Now, Mr Speaker, emissions reduction is important and we're acting on that reduction, but I can tell you also resilience to climate is also important, and hazard reduction is important, if not more important, than emissions reduction when it comes to protecting people from fire and hotter, drier, longer summers in the future. Also, Mr Speaker, in a country ravaged by drought and the impacts that we have experienced, and that drought continues, building dams is climate action now, Mr Speaker. That's what it is. All of these measures, resilience, adaptation, emissions reduction. I see the puzzlement on Labor members' faces, Mr Speaker. They don't think building dams is a way to ensure that we're building resilience for a climate in the future, Mr Speaker, which is racked with the impacts of longer, hotter, drier summers.
Prime Minister will pause for a second. Prime Minister will pause. The member for Griffith will leave under Standing Order 94A. And the member for Hunter is also warned. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party don't seem to understand that one of the things you have to do to make your climate resilient into the future is to build dams. And we've got to broaden this conversation, Mr Speaker. We've got to broaden the conversation about climate. It must deal with resilience, it must deal with adaptation, and it must deal with emissions reduction. But this government will not tax people more to get emissions reductions down. We won't put their electricity prices up to get emissions reduction down, and we will not wipe out industries to get emissions down.
Has concluded the